I thought I'd start out by talking about the role of the board from a financial perspective. And let me start out by saying that a lot of this will be geared toward a 501c3 organization. And based on who is showing up in the chat, some of you may not be 501c3s. Is that possible, Mario? Yeah, so some of you may not be 501c3s, but all of this is still applicable to you. But when I talk about donations or responsibilities to funders who are philanthropists, some of that may be less applicable to you, but everything else will still work for those of you who are not 501c3s. So that's typically who we think of when we think of nonprofits. So from a financial perspective, I'm going to talk give a little more detail than Will gave about what your fiduciary responsibilities are as a board member. So I like to think that the first one, so I'm going to go through this list, is that as a board member, you really need to lead the planning efforts, at least at a strategic level, if you're a larger organization or more mature organization, and certainly at the operational level, if you're a younger organization or an all-volunteer organization. That you need to plan early and you plan often. You're thinking of contingencies. You're thinking about the program ideas you have, about the work you'd like to do, and making sure you have the financial resources either already committed or you know where they'll come from to pull off those activities. So planning is a really important role of the board when it comes to your fiduciary responsibility. And that leads to the second bullet point here, which is you really need to be objective and honest and efficient when you're planning and when you're thinking about financial decisions. So what does that look like? Well, being objective and honest means that you're clear about how you can raise money if you're dependent on philanthropic donations, that you're being objective and honest about the likelihood of receiving that big foundation grant. If you are an organization that relies on government contracts or grants, that you're objective and honest about how likely those grants are or those contracts are to continue. So you have to be brutally honest with yourself. There's a tendency, because we get so excited about the work we do in nonprofits, to be, in my experience, to be overly ambitious and think that we can find money even when we don't know where it might come from. So be objective and honest. And then the third point has been made several times, but I want to stress it and give some examples of how this can work in practice, because it's not always as simple as it seems. And that is making sure that in your role as a board member, you are acting in a capacity that is free from conflicts of interest. And all of us here, I think, are from relatively small communities, and it's really easy for lines to get blurred between your role as perhaps even a consumer or stakeholder of your organization, as a board member of your organization, as someone who's owns a business in the community. So these lines can get very blurred very quickly. So an example might be that you have you're an electrical contractor in your community, and maybe your nonprofit, you're on the board of a nonprofit who is going to do some renovation work on a building. Well, there might be a question about whether you can respond to inquiries or requests for proposals for contractors to do that work. And the simple and cleanest answer is that you shouldn't. But the reality is, in small communities, is that sometimes those conflicts are going to be unavoidable. You may be, in fact, the only contractor who can complete the project on time and on budget for the nonprofit. So what I like to remind everyone is that you should complete every year a conflict of interest statement and you should, affirm that you understand the conflict of interest policy and you will not operate with conflicts, but conflicts sometimes exist. So the IRS does not have a prohibition against all conflicts of interest. What they require is that they be disclosed and transparent. So you have to disclose them to the full board, and you need to be transparent about what those conflicts are. And if conflicts are inevitable, you make sure that you have controls in place, like maybe the rest of the board approving a contract or reviewing the work or approving invoices before that work is done. The fourth role is to really serve as a financial inquisitor. So if you have a wonderful and great staff, and I'm sure most of you do, it can become really easy to just trust whatever the staff says is good. And, I've run into this as a staff member at a number of nonprofits where it's just too easy for the board to assume that because I'm a CPA, because I have a lot of experience, that they can just sort of trust everything I'm putting in front of them. But your role is to, not to question the staff to a degree that's uncomfortable or unreasonable, but to really pose questions and make sure that they've thought through what they're reporting to you, that they've thought through all the issues. So serving as a financial inquisitor is really important, even if you feel like you have a great treasurer or a great staff who's capable of reviewing this financial information. Every one of you on the board has a fiduciary responsibility, and you cannot outsource that to the one finance person on the board or to your staff. That is your responsibility, regardless of how much financial expertise you have. So you need to make sure that your organization has a realistic and well-considered financial plan. And what does that consist of? That you understand where your resources are coming from. Are they coming from donations? And if so, what kinds of donors and how many donors? Do you understand, if it's contracts, which government contracts? Are they likely to continue? If it's user fees, how vulnerable are you to interruptions like the pandemic, and other catastrophes that could happen? And that financial plan should be documented, should be written out. It doesn't have to be complicated. And then how are you spending your resources? How are you allocating those resources? How much to personnel? How much to programs? How much to overhead? And you need to ensure that that financial plan is consistent with your strategic plan. Too often I see plans where we have a very, very ambitious strategic plan, and then there's this financial plan that's grounded in reality, and the two never meet, right? And so you have to make sure that when you're developing strategic goals and strategic plans, that your financial plan, which remember should be realistic and well considered, supports the activities and the tactics and strategies that you've laid out in your strategic plan. And it's what are we on now? 7th bullet point. It's your role as a board member to ensure that appropriate checks and balances are in place to prevent fraud, errors, and abuse. So in the accounting world, we call these internal controls. So you may hear your accountant or bookkeeper refer to those as internal controls. And what are they? They're just policies and procedures that make sure that no one has the opportunity to steal resources, misplace resources, lose resources without getting caught, right? So maybe you require 2 signatures on checks over a certain amount. Make sure that whoever is signing the checks is not also the person receiving the bank statements. If you look online, there's a lot of resources for very simple controls and checks and balances to protect your organization's resources. One of your fiduciary's responsibilities is to make sure that your funders' requirements are managed and met. So I've seen this happen in nonprofits where maybe there's a restricted gift and the donor says, I want it to go for X. And the staff says, well, we really needed to make payroll last month, so we sort of borrowed from that money. We promise we'll pay it back in a couple of months when more money comes in. You cannot do that. You have to protect any restrictions on funding and make sure that those funders' requirements are managed and met. And I'm going to kind of skip these because we're going to talk about these more on some other slides, some of these other ones. All right, so what does a financially healthy nonprofit look like? So a financially healthy nonprofit is one in which your commitment to the financial process and your process are as important as a number. So a lot of people think if you just get reports every couple of months and you're looking at those reports and they kind of look okay, that's enough. And the reality is that it isn't, because you need to understand what those numbers are telling you. You need to engage with the financial process, which is budgeting, monitoring those budgets, thinking strategically about how you're using your financial resources. It's not just looking at bank statements and numbers each month. And it's your responsibility as a board to cultivate a culture of financial awareness and literacy among your board and your staff. Again, it's not okay to just have the treasurer or the bookkeeper or the executive director have the financial awareness and literacy about the organization. I'll tell you, the best way to raise more money from your donors is to make sure your director of development or your fundraisers understand how your organization works financially. I never thought I would be a fundraiser, and the reason I became one is because I realized that our donors really liked to hear about the financial situation of the organization, and having someone who could explain it was really, really compelling to them and resulted in larger donations. So make sure all of your staff understand the financial situation of the organization. You need to make sure that your financial goals are aligned with your strategic goals, which we talked about earlier. Again, all too often I've seen a board and the executive director create this beautiful, incredible, impressive, ambitious strategic plan that everyone's really excited about. And then they turn to the finance director or the bookkeeper or the treasurer and they say, okay, now make the financial plan and figure out how to make this all work. Those two have to be considered in tandem, or you end up with what I call is thinking of finance and development as the ATM at the end of the hall, right? Like your finance and your development team are not the ATM at the end of the hall, that you have to keep the financial plan, the financial possibilities, and the fundraising possibilities in mind when you're setting goals. You can't, I mean, like the easiest way to lose your director of development is to create lots of ambitious programming goals and then go tell them they have to raise the money to find it, and they weren't involved in helping us set those goals, right? So that leads me to the next point, which I feel super strongly about, and you can talk to any of the staff at Rumble, and this is exactly how we do it. Budgeting is an organization-wide process. Every major program that we have at Rumble, that program director or supervisor is very, very much involved with budgeting from the first time we start talking about next year's budget all the way through budget approval. And that's important for a lot of reasons. So the fastest way to get your staff disgruntled is to allocate resources to one program director or to one team or to one department and less to another. And maybe there's a really good strategic decision for that, and you forgot to communicate that strategic decision and the rationale for that to everyone. So you've got to get buy-in to the budgeting. I feel really strongly that when you're budgeting, you need a budget for surpluses. There's this idea and this myth out there that I swear, if I never do anything else in life, I'm going to bust this myth. And that is that nonprofits cannot make money. Like, I don't know who came up with that, but it's like the most persistent myth in the nonprofit sector. If you are not generating annual surpluses, which means you're spending less than you're bringing in, how in the world are you going to ever build cash reserves, right? The most common thing I hear from nonprofits is, I would love to have more cash reserves. I would love to have more cash reserves. I'm like, okay, what's your strategy for getting more cash reserves? Well, if I could only raise more money. I'm like, oh, so you're waiting for like Prince Charming to come in the door and write a big check, then that's going to be your reserve. Well, that, like, I would love for that to happen, but that doesn't happen. So when you're budgeting, budget for a surplus, right? We're going to raise $100,000 this year in program fees or government contracts or philanthropic money. And then we're only going to spend 90. And we're going to set that $10,000 difference aside, and that'll start to build our cash reserves. I hope that if anyone's learned anything in the last 18 months, it's that having 3 to 6 months of operating reserves is really what your organization should be targeting. And I know that it takes a long time to get there for a lot of organizations, but if you don't start today and you don't start thinking about how to get there, it'll never happen. Ideally, a financially healthy nonprofit will begin the fiscal year with at least a half a year's funds in the banks, right? That's that 6 months of operating reserves. But again, that takes time to build up. So if you're not there yet, don't beat yourself up, but maybe commit to trying to get there over time. And then I want to skip the next one and talk about diverse funding sources. So all too often, nonprofits are dependent on that one angel donor or those 2 angel donors or that one big government contract or one big source of program fees that maybe aren't sustainable. So if your revenue sources are not diversified, you need to start thinking strategically about how you can diversify them, because anything could happen to those 1 or 2 major donors. Anything could happen to that government contract, even if you've had it for 25 years. So really think about how you can diversify your funding sources, or what your plan is if one of those sources suddenly disappears. Because I've had that happen to me, I can tell you. It happens, it's not myth. And so make sure you're planning if you're overly dependent on one funding source. And that's why those reserves are helpful, right? Because they can help you carry through while you're trying to figure out how to respond to an unexpected loss. And you need to make sure that your organization has a sustainable business model, right? So again, like not the wing and a prayer budget, right? Like not the, okay, this is all the things we want to do. The need is great. The work is great. We have to do it. And we'll just figure out how to make the money. We'll figure out how to make it work. Please, please stop doing that and be much more realistic about what's possible and what isn't. On the flip side, don't be too conservative, right? Be realistic about what your organization can do, but challenge yourself, push yourself just a little bit. I feel like I see nonprofits at one end of the spectrum or the other. They're either way too conservative and not taking enough risks and pushing themselves enough on the program side, or they're so outrageous and ambitious that they're constantly chasing yesterday's money, and both are not sustainable business models. And last, and hopefully if you don't take anything else away, it's this: finance always has a voice at the table. You don't go talk to the finance people or the treasurer after you've made a decision. Bring them in. You'll find that people who have careers in finance or really deal with the numbers in your nonprofit are generally pretty strategic thinkers. So they can also be really powerful thought partners for what you're thinking about doing. But make sure finance always has a voice at the table. One of the things I see is that nonprofits live and die by their budget to actual, but they don't really pay attention to what their cash cycle looks like over the course of a year. So make sure you really understand that, because a lot of us are cyclical and seasonal, especially those of us who are in resort or mountain communities. So really planning what your cash needs, your cash inflows, your cash outflows are going to look like on a monthly basis, and doing that on a rolling basis so that you're always looking out, 3 to 6 to 12 months ahead of time is really, really, really important. One of the things that I see a lot of nonprofits doing is when they're preparing like a 12-month cash projection, they'll just take the entire budget and divide it by 12, like every line item on the budget, right? But for how many of us, even in our personal lives, does that really reflect how we receive money or how we spend money, right? You frequently have lump in some payments like insurance costs or certain program costs or staff bonuses that don't meet that, pretty 12-month cycle where it's the same amount each month. And never, ever, ever include your restricted cash as part of that cash forecast, unless those funds are actually going to be able to be used for something that you're going to be spending out of your operating budget. Because I always see, I've seen nonprofits before who are like, well, we're great. We have $250,000. I'm like, wow, you have $250,000 as unrestricted money. That's great. And they're like, oh, no, but like 200,000 of that is for a building we haven't built yet. Well, don't include that 200,000 in your cash projections, because you can't borrow from it and you can't spend it. It's like untapped until the need that is given for. So I can't stress enough the importance of having cash reserves. I stole this from someone, and unfortunately I can't give them credit because I don't remember who it was, but years ago, I saw this line that said, no margin, no mission. And I loved that, because if you don't have a surplus in your operating budget to support like building of cash reserves, to have a little bit of contingency in your budget, then your mission is really in jeopardy and is threatened. So I love that. No margin, no mission. And as I said, the best way to generate those reserves is to budget for operating surpluses and really work, make that one of your annual financial goals, is to generate those operating surpluses. A lot of people think that cash reserves are only for crises, like we saw with the pandemic last year and this year. But I feel really strongly that cash reserves are also important for opportunities that may come your way, right? So at Rumble, we've built some pretty healthy cash reserves. And just like many of your communities, housing is a huge problem here in the Valley. And we're very concerned about our ability to keep and retain staff, especially senior level staff in the coming years. Well, we have a very healthy reserve, and we had an opportunity to buy some land that we can put staff housing on. So that was an opportunity that we were able to take advantage of that really helps the organization, but it was only because we had cash reserves that we were able to pursue that. So budgeting is one of the most important things you'll be a part of, I think, as a board member. So I have these 8 steps for successful budgeting that I like to use, and they're just really simple. And they start with a point that I made earlier, which is get everyone involved, the board and the staff, right? And this goes, it's really about building consensus about how the organization is going to allocate its resources, right? And I'll tell you, this is one of the best ways to really enhance the culture of your nonprofit. If the staff is involved, if the board is involved, if everyone really understands why we're making these decisions, because sometimes budgeting can involve hard decisions, you're much more likely to get buy-in. People are going to understand them, and it's a much more positive working environment. So you get everyone involved, you set your big goals, you do really a high level organizational budget, the sort of a snapshot of where you think money's coming from and generally what you're going to spend it on. And then you'd dig into the details. I see too many people build a budget from all these tiny little pieces all the way up, start with the big picture, and then fill in the details. And it's a much more effective process. And you'll be getting these slides so you can read these later. So then the final thing is, what does useful financial reporting look like? So I'm a very atypical CPA in that, I mean, I love spreadsheets like every CPA, and I love accounting software like every CPA, but I really like to understand the stories that those numbers are telling me. And so when I look at spreadsheets, when I look at financial reports, I'm thinking about the programs. I'm seeing the people involved. I'm trying to really understand what's driving the performance or lack of performance that I'm seeing in those numbers. And one of the ways I do that is that I really try to identify the key performance indicators for the organization I'm working with. So for some organizations, it's program revenue. For some, it's keeping a tight lid on expenses. For others, it's payroll expenses. For some, it's the number of tickets sold. So really what you need to ask yourself is, how do you define success within your organization? And then identify key performance indicators, things you can measure, you can quantify, that will help you understand whether you're achieving that success or not. And a lot of those can be financial indicators. But then you need to make sure you're capturing data in a timely manner to look at those KPIs and to understand what's happening with the key performance indicators, so that if you need to pivot, make a change, if things are falling behind, if maybe things are further along than you expected, that you can adjust. And when you have financial reports, you really need to think about your audience. Is this an internal audience? Do we need a lot of detail? Is it an external audience? In which case, maybe charts and graphs are a better way to tell our story. What's their level of financial literacy? Are they CPAs? Then by all means, throw the spreadsheets at them. If they're not CPAs, are there other ways we can tell the story of what's happening financially within our organization that might be more effective? So when you tell your financial story, I love this. I use this format every time I do a financial report. Where were we? Where are we today? Where are we going? It's the simplest way to do it. And if you look at just a balance sheet at one point in time, it doesn't tell me where we were, it doesn't tell me where we're going, right? So maybe I'll use a balance sheet, but then I'll give some context. Here's where we were a year ago, a quarter ago, or whatever time frame is relevant. Here's where I think we're heading. Here's what my forecast looks like, right? Telling that whole story over a period of time. When you're telling your story, make it clear whether your funding sources support the program mix that you need, that you think you have. And if not, advocate for those resources. Develop a strategy for developing them. As you're telling your story, think about whether you're investing in your organization's future. Are you just thinking about the next 2 months, 3 months, or even 4 weeks because you're just trying to get by? Or are you thinking and planning on midterm and long-term horizons? Are you able to keep up with your financial obligations? You know, one of the things, unfortunately, that happens in nonprofits is we're not planning effectively for cash, or something unexpected happens, that donation doesn't show up in time. And then we start to dip into our reserves, or we start to borrow on our line of credit. And before long, we're in this vicious cycle. So make sure you can keep up with your financial obligations. And then make sure you're wisely allocating your resources. You should be able to tell that in your story if that's what you're doing, right? Keep it all simple. And pictures and stories I love pictures and stories in financial reports. Love it, love it, love it. They can be as useful as numbers. And remember, what you're doing with financial reporting is you're making sure that decision makers have useful information. So make sure you're presenting it in a format that they can understand, that they can use, that stimulates discussion, that really helps the other board members fulfill their fiduciary responsibilities as well.